How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, great discussion we're going to have today. We're going to be talking about Wade Wilson. There he is. If you guys are not familiar with Wade Wilson, this is who he is. Basically, Wade Wilson was convicted of the 2019 murders of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz in Cape Coral, Florida. He was sentenced to death in May of 2023 for Melton's murder and received a life sentence for Ruiz's murder. The case attracted attention due to the brutality of the killings and Wilson's erratic behavior during his trial, where he occasionally represented himself. Wilson's death sentence was upheld on August 27, 2024, and he has since been transferred to Florida's death row facility. Wilson has filed an appeal against his death sentence. That's the latest update with that. My guest today is going to be Russ Hamilton, and we're going to talk about life on death row for an inmate. I do got some facts I like to bring about during our discussion. I was able to talk to some officers who worked in Florida, as well as do some research about Florida's death row. In this case here, Union Correctional Facility. That's where they house some of their death row inmates. And my guest today is going to be Russ Hamilton, who's actually worked on death row in San Quentin. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear a little bit about, his life, his experiences on death row. And then I'll go ahead and maybe translate some of that to some of the information I got about how Florida runs their system. Now, granted, guys, got some books on the market, Inmate Manipulation Decoded and Breaking Boundaries. These books are both related to the game of manipulation. This book's been out in the market for quite some time. And this book right here just showed up on Amazon. And this is really about understanding the process of undue familiarity. If you guys are looking to get some training going, pick up both these books. Available on Amazon as we speak. I believe they're $25 a piece. Then we also have, from Blue 360 Media, my publisher, Tips for New Correctional Officers and Their Supervisors and How to Succeed in Corrections. These books are loaded with tons of advice if you want to be successful in this career. And it's not just from me. It's from other professionals in the field who added their input, which helped me strengthen the value of the passages that I provide in that book. And then I have this one that just came out, Managing Inmate Behavior, a little small, but it's about $20, available on Blue 360 Media. Guys, tons of information here as well. Small book, but it's loaded with information. And it tells a pretty good story about an officer and a sergeant that kind of is in the backdrop of this book. But I enjoyed writing this book. And again, it's great to have this available now. And this book is really meant to bridge the gap between an inexperienced officer and to becoming a senior veteran. So if you guys get a chance, please check this out on Blue 360 Media. And I have two other books coming to the market soon, Unlocking Leadership Potential within that corrections context. And then we also have Definitive Guide to Report Writing. And I believe these books are put together to bridge that gap, the gap that we need, that knowledge that we need. Russ, what's up, brother?
Hey there, Anthony. How's it going?
Good. You mind introducing yourself once again, please?
Sure. My name is Russ Hamilton. I am a former and retired sergeant from California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. I started my career in San Quentin back in 1989. I ended up as promoting to sergeant eventually. From there, I went on after retiring to work at a juvenile facility as a senior correctional officer. I currently work for a private company where we do reentry and rehabilitation work for a local county jail where I am the case manager and for a local county probation department. I'm also the founder of Keepers of Chaos, and it is the best thing going on Facebook for corrections. And that's because we specifically focus on the professional side of everything that goes on in corrections. No matter what title you have, we have something there for you. And we make sure that we are devoid of a lot of the nonsense and hate that go on at some other sites that you might be involved in. So anyway, that about does it for me.
All right. And guys, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Russ's experiences on death row. And then I'm going to also kind of relate that to some of the facts I have about how the Florida DOC operates their death row. And I also have 10 questions that were sent my way already. And I believe I've answered all 10. So I'll make sure we add that to the dialogue as well. But we do have a lot to discuss here. I went to do some research, and the latest research I had on how many people were on death row, and I don't know if this is up to date because it's of April 2003, was there was 297 people on death row. 294 were men. 294 were men, 3 were women. and they have the male inmates that are housed at Florida State Prison and Union Correctional Institution, while the female are housed at Lowell Annex. And I believe yesterday, so today's the 30th, yesterday the 29th, there was an inmate in Florida that was just executed. So I don't know if that number reflects that, because it looks like the date on that is April of 2023.
Take one off the count.
Yeah, maybe it's or maybe there's a few that they didn't add on. But you're right. As I said, the last date I have there is April of 2023. So I think some stuff has to be uploaded. If you guys have more recent stats, let me know. Hey Russ, so you worked on death row. Let's talk about San Quentin's death row. I mean, how big is was San Quentin's death row? Do they still have death row there? No, right?
That's a complicated question that could take its own show, actually, with regards to the things that our scum governor has done without trying to go through the legislature like he's supposed to.
Are you talking about the Norwegian idea? The Norwegian idea?
Well, not just the Norwegian idea, but the fact that we have all these people that are sentenced to death. They're condemned individuals, but they're no longer being housed exclusively on the row. They're being parceled out to different prisons all over the place in some vague hope, I think, that eventually, before he leaves office, he will probably commute their sentences or pardon them, for all I know. But before I go too far off on that tangent.
But Russ, I actually want to add something. There's a good thing about what we're having this discussion is that it looks like Florida. So I don't know if people want to consider that a newer system. I don't agree with that system either, but the way it's painting it out is it's probably like this advanced system for rehabilitation. Florida still operates on the system that you may be more familiar with, which requires higher levels of security, and in some level, I'm okay with saying the word here. We'll just define it, but in some level, isolation. So it's great to have your older experience in here, because Florida still operates on a more strict environment. So I would love to hear kind of old school San Quentin.
Yeah. So San Quentin, when I was there, we were getting toward, I think, 500 condemned inmates. And basically you had death row, and death row was in 3 different portions of the prison. The biggest of which was East Block Bayside, which is a 5-tier facility. And it's wrapped around by 2 gun walks where we had armed lethal force able to look inside into each cell from there. The other portion was what was called the Adjustment Center, kind of infamously known for what happened there on Black August, August the 21st, 1971. And that's a 3-tier thing, but it's not open tiers, it's single tiers. And I guess you could say that that is where the worst of the worst were kept. We called them grade Bs back then. And so they were housed there. And then last but not least, we had what was referred to as the Shelf or North Block 6th tier. And basically that was a tier subdivided by itself apart from the other 5 tiers in North Block. There was no actual access to them. It was its own floor on the very top of North Block. And we had basically, I guess you could call them the best of the worst in that area. It was kind of a privilege to live up there and to be able to go to rec up on the roof and so forth. And so between all of those things were where we operated death row. And it was pretty much operated kind of like a seg unit, except that they were allowed pretty much to have massive amounts of property because of their legal work. Not so much with the ones that were in the adjustment center, because that was much more dangerous, much more not high profile, but high risk inmates that we handled there. And so that was the basic breakdown of what we did. Due to, I think it was the Madrid consent decree. I could have that wrong, but I think that's the right one. We had only one inmate per cell. And basically you had, a lot of movement, especially in East Block, of course, which was the biggest part of it. We would actually have to do, escort relays every day, from the first tier to the top. and back down again in order to get everyone out to yard. And so, and because everyone had to be in handcuffs, everybody had to be stripped out. And it was very, very labor intensive. I think sometimes we would have, 25, maybe not that many, but maybe like 20 officers or so that would be working inside that one unit. And so it was very intensive, and it was much more strict over in the adjustment center. A lot of those guys over there, we would have to have, 2-on-1 escorts or 3-on-1 escorts and things like that going on. And that one was much more controlled, much more rigorous, much more dangerous though, too.
Right. So in Florida, their death row cells typically are 6 feet wide, 9 feet long. These cells are designed for single occupancy, like you said, and contain basic amenities such as bed, toilet, and sink. The limited space reflects the isolated nature of death row confinement, which with inmates spending the majority of their time in these small cells. Is that very similar to the cells in San Quentin, 6x9? And
I do believe that is actually the exact dimension, because that was part of the thing is that we were only allowed to double bunk people in there if they weren't on death row and if they weren't in some type of restrictive housing like that. And I believe it was 6x9. So they're all stacked up in there. If you've ever seen it, and you can look from the bottom in East Block all the way to the top and see all 5 tiers. It's pretty impressive or oppressive looking, and it's kind of it's kind of a thing that really makes you stop and think when you see it for the first time, because it really truly reeks of danger. And just seeing how high up it goes and the feeling that you get when you're inside there, especially the first time, does make you stop and think.
Yeah, so remember, death row inmates, they're considered, one, a danger to others, but they're also considered a danger to themselves. So the measures that are taken are going to be high security measures, which include when they're out, two officers escorting them. Most likely the inmate is going to be restrained, correct? When they're moving around from A to B, especially if they're having direct contact with the officers?
Yeah, it all starts out with a strip search. And basically what happens is the inmate hands you all of his clothing. You check it all for any contraband. Then they perform the strip search. And it was really difficult at San Quentin, at least in East, well, I guess all of them, East Block, because they had a black mesh that was over all of the bars. And so it was very difficult to see inside. So you really had to use your flashlight, and you ended up having to, do the strip search. You would hand them back part of their clothing, and then they would come out. They would put back on their boxers. They would put back on their shoes. And then as they came out, they were handcuffed, and you would drape the rest of their clothing over the cuffs. You would walk them down to the next officer who would take them. And then when they got back down to the bottom, they would go through the strip search all over again. So we would have 2 strip searches on the way out, and then they would be matriculated out onto the yard, so to speak. That kind of came to an end after they got rid of the security yards. The security yards, we had overhead lethal force options available to us through H&K 9mm carbine rifles. But later on, they went in and they replaced those yards with 2-man enclosures. We kind of pejoratively referred to them as dog runs, if you will, where you would bring down, not in this case because they only had 1 per cell, but we would bring down cellies on the segregation side, and they would go into these so-called dog runs together, and that's how they were able to have the recreation. Before, we used to have the much larger yards, and sometimes we'd have 15, 20 guys out on each of those yards. But needless to say, the propensity for violence in those cases was much higher. And there were times that, we would have incidents and, be shooting block guns or even worse yet, sometimes we'd have to deploy lethal force to stop fights, to stop, assaults and that kind of thing. I mean, I saw at least 2 cases out there where we shot inmates to death. And so it's a very grim place, and it has a very grim reality to it. And that's all the more I'll add for right now. I'll save some of the other stuff for later.
I think Florida operates a little bit differently. I text somebody just to confirm, but you could have some death rows, like Russ mentioned, where maybe they allow for a few inmates out at once for yard. Gives them a chance to interact with whatever that required out of cell time may be, which we'll go into. But Florida may run on such a strict measure that they do not allow the inmates to interact with other inmates, including inmates that are also on death row. From what I'm reading here, it is a very tight system, which means that the inmates are not just isolated from GP, they're also isolated to some extent from each other. Now, mind you guys, there has been a push now because a lot of people, again, the word isolation, it depends on the context. We use isolation in an effort for safety and security. Some may use isolation as a word that they filter through some mental health decompensation. But with that said, inmates now, no matter how dangerous they are, no matter even if they pose a danger to the facility, a danger to staff, whatever it is, they must be allowed the opportunity to exit their cell for a few hours. Some states want at least 4 hours a day. Florida looks like they only go for 2 hours a day, and this can be very cumbersome. This is why inmates on death row or inmates on very close custody units that require high-level security, why it costs so much, because just the effort to bring the inmate out, the type of supervision that they need. And remember, they're out by themselves, so you can't bring them out in masses. It becomes very overwhelming on the system. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, it is. First of all, it's very labor intensive to do all of these things and to make sure that you never make a mistake. And it only takes one little hitch in the giddy up on on any given day to throw everything out of whack. And so when you're doing all these things and you're doing all of these strip searches and you're trying to get everyone out there, it's you're right. The word is cumbersome, and especially when it falls under what a court has deemed to be the minimum amount of time that they should be out there, because that usually, gets fostered in as an absolute right rather than an absolute privilege. And so it's very difficult to mess with any of that. You can only do it, for true emergencies and, operational things like lack of manpower. It's not an emergency. Things like, we had some other, plant issues or things like that, not really necessarily an emergency. So it can be, very difficult. And, hearing that, Florida has, a couple of hundred prisoners, probably much more manageable. I think that San Quentin, was up over 600 the last I counted. But they've gone now and really, truly screwed up death row just by doing some really stupid things in that state due to the talents of one very stupid Governor Newsom.
Yeah, and guys, so just to reiterate, so the security measures when moving an inmate out of their cell, these are death row inmates. They're going to be escorted by at least 2 officers to ensure high security, and this protocol applies to all movements, including those for medical visits and exercise. So anytime you're moving an inmate from point A to point B, once they get settled, and then you're no longer in direct contact with them, it should be safe to then remove their restraints from whatever the I'm calling them food ports, but whatever the Sally port is. What do you want to call that, Russ? The little cage.
I usually just call those cuffing ports, and you put them on the other side, and usually it's part of it. Sometimes it's a double door. Sometimes they have doors that go to different yards or whatever. And from there, it's still a very dangerous procedure, because you have to either reach in there or hopefully they have to extend their hands out. But that only puts them at a slight disadvantage, whichever way that goes. Then you have to manipulate the handcuffs, off of them by, operating the key. And then from that point, they go into whatever type of yard that they have. I've seen a few different places, run things a few different ways, but that's usually the way it goes. You bring them from their cell, down there in cuffs, under escort. I've seen places that, handle it more with they have, opening and closing doors and they move them along that way. It just kind of depends.
And for these interactions, if there's ever a moment where you see there's an officer with direct interaction with that inmate without restraint, you got a security concern. Usually, even if there's an emergency, let's say there's a medical emergency in these units, which, the inmate's not posing a threat, there's a medical emergency, you don't open up that cell door unless you have a sergeant there and another officer. So this way you walk into those cells with a sergeant and two officers. It's a lot different than a regular GP unit where you may radio the code in, make sure everybody knows what you're doing, and then you may go in as long as the scene is safe to start trying those life-preserving measures. But even I would still rather wait until I at least have backup. But some people say once they're in general population, it's a little bit more. It's a less strict with protocol. But with that said, in this case here, for any death row inmate, because they would be considered the highest level of custody, is that if you have to open up that cell door for any reason, especially if, let's say, it's a medical emergency, I'm not talking about like a cell extraction or the guy's being violent. I'm talking about let's say a medical emergency where the inmate at this point doesn't pose a direct risk to you, but you have to get in because there's a pressure to get in. You got to have that backup officer and you got to have that sergeant. And going back to out of cell time, so I want to talk about what the inmates have in their cell. So death row inmates are allowed approximately, we talked about 2 hours a day outside their cell. And again, when the officers are doing this, the officers are noting opportunities. That if they say no, that's fine. You don't have to go out. But I'm going to note that the fact that you were offered, because if it ever goes to court or something like that and they go to challenge it, like Russ said, because it's more of a right now than it is a privilege, you got to showcase the opportunities. Now, here's a good thing now. Outside of just kind of checking it, you could also, maybe for some facilities that have body-worn cameras, you could record that interaction. Are you going to be going out taking yard today? Negative. Thank you. Done. This way they can't say later on that they weren't being offered, because the key here is you got to note that you're offering them that, because if you don't, then they start coming after you saying, well, why aren't you meeting that requirement of at least 2 hours a day? Some states have 4 hours a day for those high-level inmates. Now, granted, that doesn't mean, that they have to go out to yard. It just means they have to be out of their cell. So if they got to use a phone, if the phones aren't delivered, let's say, through the food ports or through the cells, and they have to go out and use the phone or use a kiosk, or if they want to, maybe they have to go out and get their meal, whatever it is, and they want to eat in the little table there, that all counts as out of cell time. But that really is dependent on the on what the facility allows them to do to get them out of the cell. Programming, if it's not done one-on-one in the cell, if that inmate has to be brought out, secured, that could count as out of cell time. I want to mention something here too, and I got some more stuff for you, but just real quick with the Florida system, is with these high-risk inmates, outside of that mandated 2 hours, you don't really want to take the risk of keep on having them come outside. So there's a lot of services like library, let's say, or religious services in which they're going to bring those services to the inmate. So the inmate remains in the cell, and then he could work with the whoever runs the library, or usually the legal side of things, to say what he wants, and they will go ahead and deliver what he's requested or she's requested. And the same thing for chaplaincy. Chaplaincy of religious services will come by probably daily. They're probably going to have, because when you have close custody units, usually the civilian side of things, chaplaincy, programming, mental health, they usually got to walk around these units every day, Monday through Friday. It's not like the other units where it may have to be once a week. No, they're going to have to probably walk around once a day, because these inmates may not have as much access to requests for those programs like the other inmates in GP would. But I wanted to say in their cell, so first, with the out-of-cell time, is death row inmates are allowed approximately 2 hours per day outside of cell. This is usually for exercise, conducted under strict supervision. Showers can also count as out-of-cell time, but they usually get the showers every other day. The reason why they can't get it every day is because there's a lot of inmates. So they got to do it on some rotation, right, Russ? We're doing it block by block, or there's a rotation, right? That probably is either every other day or once every 72 hours.
Right. If I recall correctly, when I was in East Block, it was every other day. Sometimes they would have access to showers out on the yard when we used to have the big yards out there. I don't know if that changed or not after that. So it just kind of depended. We would usually split the tier in half, and half of the tier would go on one day and half the tier on the next. And so they were afforded, I believe, 3 showers a week, and we would have a down day. I believe that was on Sunday back in the day.
And let me ask you a question, just for food for thought. If by chance a code happened which mess with the rotation, do you continue to go where it kind of stopped, or you continue where you should be and then get the person? Sorry, man, you're kind of out of luck, because that rotation is hard to keep once the order gets messed with.
No, you have to keep going on it and shower those people, because that's an absolute right.
All right. So now, we got some company in the background there, Russ.
Yeah.
So guys, showers, as I said, does count as out of cell time. They do get mail every day except holidays and weekends. So that's in Florida, and at least that's what it says on the site. I'm very familiar with they get mail every day except for Sunday and holidays. What about you, Russ?
If I recall correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do, is we had mail 5 days a week, but not on holidays. We didn't do the Saturday thing because, quite frankly, we didn't run the mailroom on Saturdays, and so it was just that was a down day.
Yeah, the mailroom does require staff, so maybe that does. Yeah, Monday through Friday. So maybe there would be no mail on Saturdays, which I know is a regular day for mail on the streets, but we just probably wouldn't have the staffing to go ahead and open the mailroom for delivery. So they usually get the mail on Monday through Friday. Inmates can also have snacks. So these are death row inmates. They get a radio. They could also get a 13-inch television in their cell. So, I mean, it's not that they're in their cell with nothing. They do have, like as I said, a 13-inch television, a radio. They can get books from the library. They can get programming. But the difference here, right, Russ, is pretty much, especially with programming, religious services, stuff is going to be delivered to the unit, because I think here is first off, they can't mix with the regular GP, so they're not going to be programming with other inmates. That's one thing. But second thing is if you could use that program for out of cell time, that's great. If we can get them out, but sometimes for the safety of staff, they may just program with the service provider right outside the cell door, and the inmate remains inside their cell.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can, deliver the goods, so to speak. I don't know. I'm sure that Florida probably has some different tiers of, levels within levels of their condemned row guys like that. We always had, grade A and grade B. You always want to do everything that you can, though, to not have to transport them in any way at all outside the bounds of that secure area, because it's just, absolutely, risk. It's risk taking. They can use it to set up assaults. They can use it to try and, make an escape. Or just to try and find a way to bring something back to their cell that they shouldn't have. So the more you're able to keep them on site and within the confines of condemned row, the better off you are, really.
Yes, and then as for visitations in Florida, from what I hear, it's only non-contact visits are allowed for death row inmates, and that means that's conducted with them on one side, a glass partition, and their visitor on the outside of that glass partition, so they don't have any direct contact. They are allowed to have a list of who they want to see, so they're not limited to strict immediate family. It's whoever's approved on that list. But the only difference is here is they're not allowed to have contact visits, so they're not allowed to embrace their visitor or have some level of physical contact. And as I mentioned, these visits require prior approval from prison authorities, and media interviews must also be done in a non-contact format and require both approval and inmate consent. So they do get the media that does come by. Now that's unique because media is treated like a legal visit. So with that said, you still need the authority, but usually what happens here is the media will probably contact the public information officer, and then they'll work an angle out. And as long as the inmate agrees, the media can then go ahead and interview the inmate. But in this case here, that interview with the media still says it's still going to be done in a non-contact format through a glass partition. That's something that you're used to, right, Russ? And it's any visitor that's approved. A lot of people think that it's like the other closed custody units that are punitive in nature that only allows for immediate family. But remember, guys, even though they've done what they've done at the highest level of custody, if they're non-problematic inside the facility, so if they're not doing anything foolish inside the facility, they're going to be allowed to have pretty much whoever's on that approved list that's been approved, even if it's outside of immediate family, correct?
Yeah, the way that we used to run it is, and this is going to shock some people, but the grade A condemned inmates at that time did actually have contact visits. And so that was within the confines of their own visiting room. If they were on some type of restriction, that would be taken away from them. And so that was, one of the things that was, helpful in trying to, keep them up to their best behavior possible, considering they're, convicted killers. But then the grade Bs were, highly restricted. And you can imagine that I don't think that they had the same access to media like that, though. I think that was pretty much on a case-by-case basis, and they were only allowed, kind of cursory contact, if you will, because needless to say, media is, a security issue. You go back, you can see the way San Quentin felt about that after 3 officers got killed because an attorney brought in a gun inside of a tape recorder on Black August. So, what's that?
George Lester Jackson.
Yes, and so that's kind of the thing that we probably took things with regard to the media and attorneys a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, they even with the attorneys, what my friend messaged, and again, if you're from Florida, please let me know, is that they also still have the non-contact if things have to be exchanged. So basically, it's done in a designated area, still non-contact. So the officers can observe because it is, for security reasons, but they really are not supposed to listen to anything that's being said. Their job is just to observe, to make sure both parties remain in sight. If there's an exchange, let's say the lawyer's got some documentation that must go to the inmate. What happens here is this: they may pass it off to the officer who kind of goes through it to make sure there's no contraband, but they're not reading it. They're just going through it to make sure that it's good. And then they will pass it over, to the inmate. They'll kind of be that mediator. In some cases, I've seen some facilities try to do that exchange in the middle of the partition, but I think we've done away with that because there is danger, because that exchange, especially with an inmate of that status, needs to be monitored, which means that anything that goes from one hand to the next, even if it's legal, must go through the officer's hand for review. Correct, Russ?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no room for us to fail in a mission like that. And so, we just can't allow that. And you got to think too, some of these attorneys, to be quite frank, are stupid. In that they think that, that inmate would never harm me. That was always first and foremost in my head, that, there's a possibility that this inmate is going to find a way to pull a shank out of his ass and stab this guy, even if it's only through, a paper port window or something. It's happened. It's happened a lot in a lot of different jurisdictions and counties and whatnot. And death row is no different. You give something an opportunity to happen, and it will. So we don't give opportunities for things to happen, whatever that thing is, no matter how outlandish it might seem. Because in a correctional setting, if if it's allowed for there to be a possibility, sooner or later it will happen.
Right. Now, also, I want to say when it comes to, let's say food, the inmate porters are not going to have inmate porters, inmate kitchen workers, all that stuff. They don't have any interaction with the inmates on death row, or they're not supposed to have any interaction with the inmates on death row, which means that this is one of the only units outside of a close custody punitive unit where the delivery of food or the distribution of food, like for the 3 meals, is going to be delivered by the officers who run that unit. That means that however the food gets dropped off, it gets dropped off, then the officers pick it up, and then the officers will deliver it cell by cell. Is that a practice that you're used to, Russ, at San Quentin?
Partially. That actually, just made a light bulb come on. I remember, working East Block Yard side, which was a general population unit. And of course, on the Bay side is where death row was. And I know that the lieutenant there called a couple guys into his office and told them to just be quiet and listen for a minute. And they could hear some sharpening noises being made. And the officers went back up there and were able to get into the raceway there and witness inmate porters for death row sharpening weapons on East Block Yard side. And so because of that, they ended the porters in there. And so if the dumbwaiter broke down after that point there, we just had to, muscle it up, 5 flights of stairs to get it up to the 5th tier. Actually, 4 flights of stairs to get it up there and to get, all the food set up because, it's a lot. You had, I think it was 57, inmates on each tier. And so you'd have to be hustling that up and down. And so that was when they stopped the porters from doing that. And once again, fortunately, that was a lesson we didn't have to learn the hard way. Unlike, some other lessons that have been learned along the way on death row.
All right. Someone actually just gave me, so we're actually on point because someone just gave me a link. So for the males, death row inmates are served meals 3 times a day, one at 5 a.m., 10:30 a.m., or at the beginning, 5 a.m., then from 10:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. is lunch, and then 4 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. is dinner. Food is prepared by prison staff and transported in insulated carts to the cells. Inmates are given sporks with their meals, and they eat from the provided tray. And then prior to their execution, an inmate may request the last meal. To avoid extravagance, the food to prepare the last meal must cost no more than $40 and must be purchased locally. For visitors, all inmate visitors must be approved before visitation is allowed. We got that. Questions regarding an inmate visiting days, visiting hours. Okay, that's specific to the facility. Showers, we mentioned. The inmates may shower every other day. Security, death row inmates are counted at least once an hour, but tours go from every 15 to 30 minutes. And again, those tours matter because we mentioned earlier that inmates on death row could be considered inmates that are more likely to hurt themselves or, in this case, more hurt themselves since they're single cells. So you got to kind of keep vigilant because at any moment they may decide to want to take their own life, and taking of their life, this death sentence is not on their terms. It's on when the state decides to do it. They're escorted in handcuffs and wear them everywhere except in their cells. And then, like Russ mentioned, the exercise yard and the shower. But again, when you uncuff them, you're not there with them. You are you're separated by whatever that fence or whatever it would be, and it goes partition, yeah. And it gets done to a cuffing port. They're in their cells at all times except for medical reasons, exercise, social or legal visits, or media interviews. When a death warrant is signed, the inmate is put under death watch status and is allowed a legal and social phone call. So that means when they finally go through all their appeals, which could take on average over 20-something years, then they finally sign the death warrant. And one of the questions that was asked my way, I did some research on it, are the inmates in Florida are allowed to choose from 2 methods. So let's say Wade winds up going through the whole process, and 22 years later, he exhausts all appeals, and we get ready to do the death warrant. 30 days prior, the probably the warden's going to go up to him and say, hey, this is the two ways you can die: electrocution or lethal injection. So they have to make that decision before 30 days. If they choose not to make the decision, the state will go with the default method, which is going to be the lethal injection, because it seems to be less controversial. Now, so they're in their cells. We've talked about that. Okay, so mail, magazines, entertainment. Inmates may receive mail every day except holidays and weekends. They may have snacks, include radios, 13-inch television, which we talked about, in their cells. They do not have cable television or air conditioning, and they're not allowed to be with each other in common rooms. So that's what we thought. They can watch church services on closed-circuit televisions, and while on death watch, inmates may have radios and televisions positioned outside their cell bars. Clothing. So death watch is probably going to be a constant watch observation. So when the inmate has been notified that they now have a date, so basically if you don't get that phone call, you're done, that inmate's going to be moved to an area, right, Russ, where they're put on a constant watch, because now we have to make sure that the person doesn't try to make an effort to kill themselves before the actual date is determined, or before the actual date happens for it to be carried out.
Yeah, we had, I was actually involved in many of those. When I came on in 1989, we were just ramping up to do the first execution in over 30 years. So there was a long hiatus that was going on with that. And the guy that was coming up to bat was a guy named Robert Alton Harris. And Robert Alton Harris and his brother had kidnapped two boys at a Burger King down in San Diego and taken them out in the woods and shot and killed them in order to use their vehicle in a bank robbery. So they came back and they did the bank robbery. And when they did that bank robbery, a Good Samaritan actually followed them from the bank to, I think it was one of their houses or an apartment or something, and notified the police. The police showed up and arrested them. One of the arresting officers was the father of one of the kids that was killed, but had no idea at that time that his son had been killed. And so he went through the process after the Byrd court got finished fucking up the death penalty, and it was brought back by George Duke Majan, who authored the new death penalty law. And so basically, we were waiting for all this to unwind, and he had several times that he was up to bat, so to speak. And so you would go in there, and he was, in his cell, and every 15 minutes you would write down what he was doing: sleeping, watching TV, whatever it was. And so finally, I want to say it was in, I think that was in 90 that I was on that one several times. And then he got a stay of execution. And then they vacated the stay in 1992, I want to say, if I'm remembering this correctly. And that one came down so close to the wire, and different courts kept giving him stays. And then finally, Sandra Day O'Connor at the U.S. Supreme Court said no more stays will be issued by any court except this court. And so he was finally the first one that we executed. And I want to say it was like 30 years at that point. And so, you have to, once they get that warning, that notice, and they're issued the death warrant, every 15 minutes, you're writing down what they're doing. I want to say, I think it's 3 days before. See, I've been away so long, I don't remember exactly, but it's either 2 or 3 days before they move them down to a separate cell that's right next to where they changed it. Is back then it was the gas chamber. Robert Alton Harris was executed in the gas chamber, but later they were given the choice between gas chamber or lethal injection. And now, of course, they've disassembled all that paraphernalia, and the death penalty is no more. But that's for what it's worth, and my view on it.
No, I was also reading some stats. So, average inmate. Now, these stats may be a bit dated, but I'm trying to see how it relates to Wade Williams. So, the average inmate that winds up committing a crime that leaves in the death row, their age is 27.9. And then usually when they go through the appeals and the death is finally carried out, they're around 44 years old. So that's around 15, 16 years. So based on Wade Wilson, the convicted killer of Kristine, Melton, and Diane Ruiz in 2019 was 30. So he'd be around 34, 35. So he's a little above average, which means that if things carry out correctly, in his early 50s is when he would probably be carried out, especially if he's actively exhausting his appeals. And then he goes ahead and goes through everything from state to federal. I want to also mention before we get to the questions. So we talked about the approved execution methods. Just to fast forward a little bit in time. Florida allows for executions by lethal injection or the inmate's choice by electric chair, or at the inmate's choice by electric chair. The execution process is conducted under strict protocols to ensure security, legal compliance, and humane treatment. So since 1976, Florida has executed. Now, this data is as of well, then you got the one from yesterday. So I don't know how off this data may be, but it has, since 1976, Florida has executed 106 convicted murderers, all at Florida State Prison. The most recent execution was, that's off because they just had one yesterday. So that's off that state. So that's just, that data may be a little off, but obviously it's a state that's going to execute. It doesn't just say they put people on death row and not follow through. The time on death row, we talked about, inmates can spend an average of 13 to 14 years on death row due to lengthy appeal process. This extended period allows for thorough legal review and ensures that all possible avenues of appeal are exhausted before an execution is carried. So, I mean, that's a good prediction, right? You think about maybe if he was 30 when he committed the crime, so then he's in his, 30, 34, 35 now, we could probably say around early 50s, if he loses all the appeals, he would be given his death date, correct, Russ? Would you agree based on the stats?
I would say that, Florida used to be a lot more quicker about getting that stuff done. But for whatever reason, they've probably, fallen behind the eight ball and had a lot more, both federal and state, interference with regards to the carrying out of the death penalty. I know back in the day, they used to, have, I want to say there would maybe be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. But that's apparently now lengthened, to 17, 18, 19, 20. California's always had, super, super long, cases that have went on. I know that, I want to say that, I think Robert Alton Harris was on the row for beyond 20 years, but I wouldn't swear to it, but it seems to me like that's about where it was. And some of the ones they went on a little spree because they'd had so many on the row for so long, and they ticked off. I think it was about 8, and then they were done with it after that. They had an inmate named Sirapongs. They had I think it was Clarence Allen got executed. They did Tookie Williams. They did Robert Lee Massey, who was actually on death row twice. He got out the first time from death row, and he made it back out on the street, and he killed someone else. There's just a number of factors that influence all of that. I really think that there's a lot of states that are trying to stay engaged with the whole death penalty thing, but I think it's kind of going by the wayside. You can really see that in California. They've really taken a hammer to it, and just that there have been no executions, I don't think, since Tookie. I could be wrong, but I thought he was the last one.
Well, I could look that up, but they say for Florida, the record for the longest serving inmate on death row in the United States, they say, is held by Florida. Gary Alvord Alvar was sentenced to death in 1974 for the murder of 3 women in Florida. He remained on death row for nearly 40 years before dying of natural causes in 2013 at the age of 66, never having been executed. His lengthy time at death row was due to a combination of appeals, legal complexities, and mental health issues, that's another thing, the mental health issues. Hey,
you can't execute an insane man. That's the finding by the Supreme Court.
I'm looking up the last person executed in California. Last person executed in was
name them off.
Last person executed in California was Clarence Ray Allen.
Clarence Ray Allen. I knew him. He was he had a crime partner that was on death row too, named Billy Ray Hamilton. Billy Ray Hamilton killed some witnesses for him at a grocery store down in Fresno, California, along with his girlfriend. Her name was Connie Barbie, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, he's the last one. He was executed January 17th, 2006. And it says
he said his last words were "Ote hey, it's a good day to die," or something like that.
Yeah, then he says, since then, no executions have taken place in California due to various legal, political, and procedural challenges, including they have a change in death penalty imposed by Governor Gavin Newsom. So I want to talk about a couple more things, then we'll get to the questions. So obviously, death row is a kind of like a unit that kind of governs itself separately from the other units, which means that if they have disciplinary concerns or if they have protective custody concerns, actually, to be honest with you, it's more easily managed because the inmates are already isolated. So to the extent here, I know this may be a little jail talk here, but pretty much we just slap something on their door, take away some privileges and slap something on their door for their status. They don't need to be moved into other units because they're already in a high security isolated unit. So you may go in, take away a couple of things like a TV or something and slap their new status on the door, which could be a disciplinary status, or in this case, a protective custody status. So I'm going to read something here. On death row, any disciplinary concerns are handled with heightened security measures. Since inmates are already in a highly controlled and isolated environment, additional punitive measures often involve further restrictions on privileges, such as limiting out of cell time, that could be part of the sanction, and removing access to personal items or enforcing stricter monitoring. For protective custody, given that death row inmates are already isolated, protective custody measures are generally administrative, such as placing a notation on the inmate's cell door or in their file to indicate a need for special handling. The inmate may be placed under stricter monitoring, or specific instructions may be issued regarding their interaction, even with staff. It may be just supervisor-only interaction. Moving an inmate to another unit is uncommon due to the inherent segregation of death row. Does that sound correct to you, Russ?
Yeah, that's pretty much in line. Those tended to be the things that we used as well. Guys would get disciplinaries. If it was a serious disciplinary, that involved safety, security, or violence, sometimes they would get moved, sometimes permanently moved to from what we call grade A, which was either the shelf on North Block or East Block, and they would be moved into the adjustment center. I know that the very first week that I started, they found 7 shanks in Billy Ray Hamilton's security light, and they were all made out of metal. So obviously they were meant for staff. Those weren't going to make it out to the yard. And that was my very first day at San Quentin. And he got moved then. I don't know if he was grade A status, but he was in East Block, and they moved him from East Block to they moved him to the adjustment center. And he was in the adjustment center from that point, I believe, until he died.
Yeah, and guys, I like what you just said. If anybody from corrections watching this, metal weapons, we totally agree. They know that those usually go towards staff because they're not going to make it past the metal detector. That's a good. I don't want that to get overlooked. Okay, so I got 10 questions set my way. Russ, if you have any input on any of them, let me know. So I'll read the question and answer. If there's something you want to add, just let me know.
Okay.
First question that was set my way was, how does Florida decide whether an inmate will be executed by lethal injection or electric chair? And do inmates
We handled that.
We explained that,
Yeah.
but just as a reminder, Florida's death row inmates are given the choice between two methods of execution: lethal injection and electrocution. Two methods of execution: lethal injection and electrocution. If an inmate does not make a choice, lethal injection is the default option. The option to choose stems from legal and ethical considerations, giving inmates some degree of control over the method of their execution. Number two, what are the specific criteria that needs to be met before a death row inmate is moved to a different security level or facility? Death row inmates in Florida are typically housed in maximum security conditions and do not mix with the general population. Movements to a different security level or facility is rare and usually based on significant security concerns like health issues or legal requirements. Administrative decisions such as protective custody or special handling needs can also influence where a death row inmate is housed. That kind of makes sense, though. If you got an inmate that, let's say, mental health wise is decompensating while they're on death row and they don't pose a great risk, is there a good chance that they may decide to introduce them to a higher level, not a higher level unit than they're in now, but maybe the higher level of general population unit? So he has some of that interaction, so he doesn't decompensate.
I would think that they might go to a rubber room or a psychiatric thing. But I would never want to put them in any kind of a GP because they could be a target. You don't know. I mean, there's people out there where these people have killed their loved ones that could pay someone off to kill that guy, and that's why we restrict that to keeping them, all in the same type of units. They all have to be death row units. Then again, I don't pretend that I know what Florida would do, but I can just tell you, as security minded as I am, I would be very wary about that.
Yeah, and it's the way the world is shifting. So it's crazy because if you asked us this question 20 years ago, we'd have that definitive answer. It's probably they're going to go with what Russ said, but now the way the world is changing, they may kind of view to see if that person's a risk and may try to give them some level of interaction. But I agree with Russ. I mean, hopefully that would be a last resort. And it's funny because 9 times out of 10, most inmates want to have their own cell. So I don't know if a lot of people are actually fighting that anyway. How do death row inmates spend their day-to-day life, and what types of activities or privileges are they allowed? So death row inmates in Florida, we talked about this, spend most of their time in their cell, typically 6 by 9 or 6 by 9.5 feet with limited out of cell time. They're allowed approximately 2 hours per day for exercise in a secured area. Inmates can shower every other day and receive mail daily, except for holidays and weekends. They may have radios, small televisions without cable, and snacks. Visits are non-contact and must be pre-approved, conducted through a glass partition. This routine is designed to maintain security while allowing basic human interactions and personal time. Question 4, what kind of mental health support or counseling is available to death row inmates, especially given the long wait time for execution? I'll probably say they have availability to a lot more because they're going to visit the unit every day because it is a close custody unit, and inmates in close custody unit present a higher risk of hurting themselves or injury or self-injurious behavior. So death row inmates often have access to mental health services, including counseling and psychiatric care to address issues such as anxiety, depression, other mental health conditions, especially if exacerbated by long periods of isolation and uncertainty. These services are provided as part of the prison's medical program. The prolonged time of death row we talked about, which can average 13 to 14 years, makes mental health support crucial for both the well-being of the inmate and the safe operation of the facility. How does the appeal process work for death row inmates in Florida, and what impact does it have on the length of time they spend on death row? The appeal process for death row inmates in Florida is extensive and can include multiple levels of state and federal appeals. After a death sentence is pronounced, the case is automatically reviewed by the Florida Supreme Court. Inmates can also appeal a federal court, could appeal to federal court, including the U.S. Supreme Court for constitutional issues. The appeals process is a significant reason for the long duration inmates spend on death row, as it could take years or even decades to exhaust all legal avenues. A few more questions, we're almost done. How does Florida ensure the humane treatment of death row inmates, and what oversight exists to monitor their conditions? Florida Department of Corrections has policies to ensure the humane treatment of death row inmates, including access to medical care, mental health services, religious services, and legal counsel. Inmates are regularly monitored, and there are protocols to address grievances and complaints. External oversight may come from state-appointed commissions, advocacy groups, and federal inspections to ensure compliance with state and federal laws and standards for humane treatment. Guys, and Russ could talk about this real quick. When it comes to, unless there's a conflict with security, if the inmate's not a problem on death row, they should be given again, filtered through a little bit of higher level of security, some of the same privileges that are being given to GP, just a little bit more strict, right, Russ?
Yeah, they tend to have, at least in the California system, they had a lot they were allowed to have inside their cell. They were allowed to have a typewriter, for instance. That's kind of an anachronism, though, because back then they were always busy writing their appeals. And back then there was no such thing as, word processing and computers. So that was kind of a throwback, but they had a lot of other things that they were allowed to, have inside their cells. But a lot of that was strictly guided by, how much of a problem they were or weren't. But then again, if you look at it from my viewpoint, it's just a matter of not what their past is, but what their future is going to be. Because, we're always just, one bad incident away from losing, a staff member, and we never want that to happen.
Yep. And then we have, given that there are both male and female death row inmates, are there significant differences in how they're housed and managed? So both male and female death row inmates are kept in maximum security conditions with similar routines, but they are housed in separate facilities. Men are typically housed at Union Correctional Institution and Florida State Prison, while women are housed at Lowell Annex. I believe, and maybe Russ, I don't know for clarity, I believe Union Correctional Institution is where they house death row, but when they go to carry out the death sentence, is it Florida State Prison? Is that how
I don't know the answer to that. However, I would feel that you would want them right next to wherever you're going to carry it out. I would never want to transport, and I've done it. Believe me, I've transported condemned inmates, but I would never want to transport them if possible. So I'm not sure what their policy is, but I would never house them outside of the area where I was going to carry out their sentence, if at all possible. I do know that with the female inmates, we had it set up to actually transport them to San Quentin to execute them should the need ever arise, but it never arose in all the years that I've heard about it. I don't believe they've executed a female inmate since the 1950s or something like that.
So in Florida, the death sentence is carried out at the Florida State Prison located in Alfred, Florida. So Ted Bundy was actually killed there, by the way, in I think 1980.
Yeah.
The execution.
But I would tell you, I think that that's a bad security feature if if that's an actual distance far enough that they have to transport them. I just think it's.
How far are both facilities from each other? And then the other thing I want to say, because there's another thing, Union Correctional Institution and Florida State Prison are located quite close to each other. They're both situated in Rayford, Florida, and are approximately 2 miles apart. So that's not bad.
Oh, that's fine then. That's fine then. I just,
and
you know me, I'm paranoid, but that's why I'm old.
Well, it says no death sentences are not carried out. Union, we talked about that in Florida. While Union Correctional Facilities does house death row inmates, the actual executions take place at Florida State Prison, located nearby in Rayford, Florida. Florida State Prison has the execution chamber where lethal injections are administered. So I guess so if I look up why is it held at Florida State? I know they just answered. I just want to see if there's clarity. Where is the electric chair? It's got to be there too then. So executions are carried out in Florida State Prison primarily because it has a designated execution chamber specifically built for this purpose. Florida State Prison is equipped with the necessary security and facilities to handle execution process, including both lethal injection and the electric chair. The electric chair named Old Spark is also located. We talk about Florida State Prison. And then it says the prison's infrastructure is rolling. Okay, so now that's good. So he stays on death row in Union, and then they carry out the actual execution in Florida State Prison. Then you have, given that we talked about both male and female, right? Our death row inmates, are there significant differences? And we said both male and female death row inmates are kept in maximum security conditions with similar routines, but they are housed in separate facilities. Men are typically housed in Union Correctional Facility or Florida State, while women are housed at Lowell Annex. I'm assuming Lowell Annex carries the whole thing out. they're going to wind up doing the execution as well. I'm going to look into when was the last time they executed a female. The fundamental management principles are the same, focused on security, isolation, and limited privileges, but logistical differences may arise due to the facility's specific layout and resources. What are the common security concerns or incidents that occur on death row, and how are they typically handled? Common security concerns on death row include inmate self-harm, conflicts with staff, and attempts to communicate illicitly with the outside world, like Russ mentioned. These concerns are addressed through heightened monitoring, physical barriers such as non-contact visits, and strict protocols for interactions. Security incidents are handled by correctional officers trained in managing high-risk inmates, often involving the use of additional restraints, isolation, and administrative actions to mitigate risk. 2 more questions. How has public opinion on the death penalty in Florida affected the number of executions carried out? Public opinion on the death penalty can influence political and judicial decisions in Florida. While the state has maintained an active death penalty system with, at the time of this, 106 executions since 1976. I don't know if that number is specifically accurate. Changes in public sentiment can lead to reforms, such as changes in sentencing laws or the governor's decision to issue or withhold execution warrants. Public opinion can also impact legislative actions like adjustments to the appeal process or the methods of execution. And what are the most common reasons for overturning a death sentence in Florida, and how often does it happen? Common reasons for overturning a death sentence includes new evidence like DNA, prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective legal counsel, and procedural errors during the trial. Other reasons may involve changes in laws or interpretations by higher courts regarding the application of the death penalty. While not frequent, there have been notable cases where death row inmate sentences were overturned due to these factors, underscoring the importance of the appeal process in ensuring justice. So I'll guarantee you they'll do a couple of things. Think about this. If he knows he's getting the death penalty, just food for thought. He decides to represent himself, then he goes wacky. So then later on, even when he's representing himself, so then later on, when he's up on, being reviewed and going through his appeals, they're going to focus on his mental health condition when he represented himself. And they're going to talk about the due process of him representing himself. And, they talked about his erratic behavior. Well, now if he represented something, he had erratic behavior, I'll guarantee you somewhere along the line, the lawyer and not wanting to, try to help him win his appeal, they're going to push on his mental health condition. And they may even go so far as saying that he wasn't mentally able to even defend himself, therefore make the decision to defend himself. Hey,
that's why I would say that hopefully they would be keyed up enough to that now, where the judge, if he was going to allow that, would force him to have mental evaluation. I do believe that Ted Bundy represented himself, if I recall correctly, and I believe that he had to have. I believe that he had to sign some kind of waiver or something that was pretty significant. But my memory isn't what it used to be.
I put down, did Florida ever execute a female inmate, and how many, and when was the last one? So I'm waiting for the response on that. Hey, Rush, excuse me, anything you'd like to say in closing?
I think this is a great discussion. Maybe sometime we can, go a little more into, a couple of, death penalty, issues that I might know a little bit more about here in California. I know that, truly, I'm thankful to all of my brothers and sisters, in corrections. But those that, work that death row, it's hard and it's dangerous and it's dirty work. And inmates are always trying to get over on you, or file grievances, and do things like that. I had some horrible experiences on death row, dealing with people like Lawrence Bittaker, for instance. I would tap dance on his grave if I knew where it was right now. But they're the worst of the worst. And, it's our duty, whether we like it or not, to go in there and provide safety and security for everyone. And so my hat's off to the people that go in there and do that. And I can say that knowing that I was one of those for a while.
And guys, we should have got the one female right. I just didn't think it was Florida, because I remember seeing the movie Eileen Wuornos. Yeah, the movie Monster. So Eileen Wuornos executed on October 9, 2002 by lethal injection. Wuornos was convicted of murdering 6 men while working as a prostitute and claimed self-defense, stating they had either raped or attempted to rape her. And the are the executions done? And then the other female was Judy Buenano, executed on March 30th, 1998 by electric chair. She was convicted of poisoning her husband, drowning her disabled son, and attempting to murder her fiance. Oh, guys, makes sense. I apologize. I did make a mistake. Executions for the women are not held at Lowell. I apologize. So hopefully you guys watch this to the end and realize that the execution is not done. It's done in Florida State Prison, which is located in Rayford, Florida. Same thing we talked about before. So now, how far is Lowell from Florida State Prison? I just like to see for Russ's paranoia. They may be close together. I just want to see. Lowell Correctional Institution is located near California. Oh, it's 90 miles south of Florida State Prison. It's about an hour and a half to 2 hours, but they've only, I see here 2. Maybe there's more, but it just shows 2. So forgive me. I want to stand corrected. The execution still happened at Florida State Prison. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post a video. Stay safe.